Are you ready to elevate your leadership journey through exploring the wisdom of the ages? Subscribe to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast on all major podcast platforms, including Apple iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube Music. You can also find us everywhere else podcasts are available. If you find value in our episodes, please leave a 5-star review on Apple, Spotify, and of course, YouTube. We need those reviews to grow, and it is truly the easiest way to help other leaders and lovers of literature discover this show. And thank you for your support. Hello, my name is Jesan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 197. Quoting directly from our book today, and you'll note on the video that I'm going to be looking down a lot, and that's because I have a digital version of the book, so I'll be reading this off my phone. We're going to kind of break the fourth wall a little bit, tell you how I'm doing it, but it is the same book that I would have physically today. So we're going to pick up here from our book today, from our play today, actually. Act 1, Scene 1. Thunder and lightning. Enter 3 witches. First witch. When shall we 3 meet again? In thunder, in lightning, or in rain? Second witch. When the hurly-burly's done, when the battle's lost and won. Third witch. That will be ere the set of the sun. First witch. Where the place? Second witch. Upon the heath. Third witch. There to meet with Macbeth. First witch. I come, Grey Malkin. Second witch. Paddock calls. Third witch. Anon. All. Fair is foul and foul is fair. Hover through the fog and filthy air. They exit. Picking up in scene 2, alarum within. Enter King Duncan, Malcolm, Donalbain, Lennox, with attendants, meeting a bleeding captain. Duncan, what bloody man is that? He can report, as seemeth by his plight of the revolt, the new estate. Malcolm, this is the sergeant who, like a good and hardy soldier, fought against my captivity. Hail, brave friend! Say to the king the knowledge of the broil, as thou didst leave it. Captain, doubtful it stood as 2 spent swimmers that do cling together and choke their art. The merciless MacDonald, worthy to be a rebel, for to that the multiplying villainies of nature do swarm upon him. From the western isle of carns and gallow glasses is supplied, and fortune, on his damned quarrel smiling, showed like a rebel's whore. But all's too weak, for brave Macbeth, well he deserves that name, disdaining fortune with his brandished steel, which smoked with bloody execution like valor's minion, carved out his passage, till he faced the slave, which ne'er shook hands nor bade farewell to him, till he unseamed him from the nave to the chops, and fixed his head upon our battlements. Duncan, O valiant cousin, worthy gentleman. Captain, as whence the sun gins his reflection, shipwracking storms and direful thunders break, so that from that spring whence comfort seemed to come, discomfort swells. Mark, King of Scotland, mark. No sooner justice had, with valor armed, compelled these skipping carns to trust their heels, but the Norrean lord, surveying vantage, with furbished arms and new supplies of men, began a fresh assault. Duncan, dismayed not this our captains, Macbeth and Banquo? Captain, yes, as sparrows eagles, or the hare the lion. If I say sooth, I must report they were as cannons overcharged with double cracks, so they doubly redoubled the strokes upon the foe, except they meant to bathe in reeking wounds, or memorize another Golgotha. I cannot tell, but I am faint. My gashes cry for help. Duncan, so well thy words become thee as thy wounds. They smack of honor both. Go get him surgeons. The captain is led off by attendants. That is a bit from our play today. And it comes to us in this kind of way. And I want you to think about what we're going to talk about today because we're opening up a month of Shakespeare here on the show. We're going to start with this play that we are going to be covering today, and we're going to move into Coriolanus and Henry V as well. We do this every year, or at least every other year on this show. In reading this play, which, by the way, the name of it has already been revealed in the name of one of the characters mentioned, something about splitting from the nave to the chops there. One of the more interesting facts of our age, the age we live in right now, the age where we have technology like the kind that's bringing you this podcast today, one of the interesting facts of our age is the lack of tragic stories, truly, genuinely tragic stories being told via books and film. Now, don't get me wrong. Plenty of tragic circumstances are constantly splashed across our collective social media feeds from people we know, people we don't. People experience tragic circumstances across the globe everywhere. Circumstances imposed upon them by fate or identity or chance, both random and purposeful, and of course, nature itself. We observers of this stream of tragedies are, of course, tacitly rewarded by the algorithm for engaging with this stream through clicks and scrolls and eye movements. And while it may initially appear as though there are more tragedies in the world, the actual fact of the matter is that there aren't any more tragedies now than there ever were before in human history. From the burning of a random village in the Amazon in 1500 BC to a person soliciting funds for cancer treatments on a GoFundMe page in the year of our Lord 2026, tragic circumstances are a regrettable and pervasive human constant. What is missing in our tragic circumstance social media feeds is fictionalized stories of real people overcoming those tragedies to become heroic, or maybe remain anti-heroic, and succeed in the end. Now, it's almost as if we've wound up in a spot like Charlie Kaufman was lamenting in that great movie adaptation back in 2002, where he stands up and he talks to Bob McKee. You may remember this scene, Charlie Kaufman played by Nicolas Cage, where he says, what if the writer is attempting to create a story where nothing much happens, where people don't change, they don't have any epiphanies, they struggle and are frustrated, and nothing is resolved, more a reflection of the real world. The author today of the play we just read from might come down more on the side of Bob McKee's response to that postmodern lament by Kaufman more than he would with us postmoderns, I think. And the play we are covering today would be part of his answer. Today on the show, we will be discussing the hurly-burly, the nature of tragedy, and the lives of average men, which are more well documented now than at any other time in human history. Today, let us figure out how to think about in our time Macbeth, specifically the tragedy of Macbeth by William Shakespeare. Leaders, the tragic narrative of Macbeth isn't merely, quote, a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, not even in our ontologically materialistic era. And today on our show, you may have already noted if you're watching the video version of this, we have a new guest. We are bringing a new person into the fold. A new guest co-host is joining us. This is her very first time on the show. Welcome to the show, Katie Mestres. Katie Mestres is an artist, actor, educator, human, and clown from Middletown, New Jersey. She has 2 master's degrees, which qualifies her to be here, probably even more so than me. One in Shakespeare and performance. One in Shakespeare and one in performance, I'm sorry, from Mary Baldwin University, located in Staunton, Virginia. She's been working in the theater community on and off stage for over 25 years, finding love in performance, design, and puppetry. We may talk a little bit about puppetry today, too. I want to know if there's ever been Macbeth done in puppetry. She loves script analysis and digging into Shakespeare's poetic and not so poetic texts. And by the way, before we before we open the door for her to come in and say her piece, she was recommended to us by another guest, Ryan Stout. And so This is a case of someone having an excellent experience coming on and then saying, hey, this dude's doing something interesting. You should probably pay attention to this thing over here. So we love it when our guest co-hosts recommend other guests to come on to the show. With all that being said, how are you doing today, Katie? How's it going? Oh, you're muted.
I did that to myself.
Okay.
I'm doing pretty well. Thank you for having me on the show. I just want to clarify the master's degrees thing. So the program itself is called Shakespeare Performance, and I have two master's degrees in that specific one. So one is an MLit, which is just a fancy European way of just saying a regular master's degree, and the following is an MFA, which is my Master of Fine Arts.
Got it. Okay. All right. Cool. Again, we like to get those things accurate um, on the show. And again, that qualifies you more to speak probably on this than myself. I'm just a schmuck who reads. Um, I like to think I'm a fairly intelligent schmuck, but just a schmuck who's reading. So, I want to talk a little bit before we really jump into Macbeth itself and really start pulling apart some of the themes that I think are evident here for leaders in this play. I want to mention that in order to get my arms around Macbeth, number one, well, a couple of things. First, I tragically always confuse Macbeth and Hamlet together in my brain. Like I merge them together in my brain for some reason, which is terrible because we covered Hamlet on this show. I should know better by this point. Um, but I still kind of do that. But now, post reading Macbeth and now talking with you, I don't think I'll be doing that in the future anymore. I watched two performances of Macbeth in preparation for this episode, and I watched the film version of this play starring Michael Fassbender and Marion Cotillard just to get my arms around that. And that version you can go and check out on Amazon. As you know, folks who listen to the show, I'm also a huge film junkie, so I had to go look up the film. I also read a series of essays on Shakespearean tragedies by A.C. Bradley, which I had no idea who that person was before I sort of stumbled onto all of this. I'm sure Katie knows, and she's going to tell me all the problems with Bradley and his analysis. But it was written. Well, one of the things we do on the show is we tend to look at the writer in the context of the time in which he wrote, and we don't try to apply like our current context to him. We just sort of take him as he or her as he or she happens to be, because it's usually the best way to do them their best diligence. However, with that being said, I can see where folks would have a challenge with Bradley. Although his analysis on Macbeth was very interesting, we borrowed some of his things here. We'll talk about those today. Um, One of the things that has struck me, Katie, is that we keep revisiting Macbeth as well as Hamlet and King Lear and Othello in film and in TV. And this is what I sort of opened up with on the show today, and even on podcasts like this, because it fulfills some deeper longing in us around how to make a narrative sense of tragic circumstances. And I think that that's really what lies at the core of Macbeth. But you've clearly got expertise in this space. So I defer to you. What do you think of Macbeth and your background with Shakespeare? And talk a little bit about sort of how you think about this play that seems to never run out of steam or hasn't run out of steam in the last 400 years.
Yeah, so my opinion on Macbeth is probably different than a lot of other people's. It's really just based on personal preference in comparison to his other works. I do enjoy reading the play. It's a quick read. It's short. I think it's his shortest tragedy. It's easy to understand. It's well written. Has a lot of great monologues and soliloquies. But in terms of theatrical performance, I am sometimes so bored by it because it's one of his more popular ones to do. It's one of his easiest ones to cut and put together. And obviously, you don't have to get any kind of royalties because there's no living heirs to Shakespeare, nothing. Nobody owns his estate. You just do whatever you want with the script. Um, but the fact that you can do whatever you want with the script, but people still tend to do the same things over and over and over again. They don't come at it with a different viewpoint. I mean, it's a very straightforward play anyway. But if it's not well directed and if it's not well performed, it has a tendency to drag. And I've seen a performance where they cut nothing from the script, or at least it seems that they kept like cut nothing from the script, and there was just some scenes that just went on and on and on. It was just exposition. I was like, yes, we already know this happened. Why are you reliving it? We don't care. We want to see the action. We want to see it happen. You go to see a play, you go to hear a play, but like, I don't know, there's something about Macbeth that doesn't, it also doesn't connect to me. Like, I can't
Hmm.
find a lot of salience in it. And I
Hmm.
don't know if, I mean, I think modern audiences, they'll like it, but I wonder if they like it because it's like, oh, well, this is Shakespeare. This is Macbeth. I have to like it because everybody likes it because it's popular. But, you don't have to like it. He didn't write
Hmm.
bangers all the time, right?
Hmm.
Um, but there's for me, it's not a real connection to like a modern audience because we don't have kings. We don't
Hmm.
have people who are succeeding to the throne. We don't have thanes and dukes and things like that. So all of these people that come in, it's like, who are these people? But for some reason, like the history plays, which I used to think, oh, well, those are probably really boring. The history plays to me sometimes are way more exciting than Macbeth because Macbeth
Hmm.
is just, oh, it's done over and over and over again. But you always see something fresh with like the other history plays, like the Henrys or um like
Richard the Third.
Richard the Third, yeah, like
Yeah.
those kind of plays. Like people, I think they're a little bit more exciting. I think
Yeah.
the beginning of Macbeth is way more exciting than the end, which sounds counterproductive, but I think because Lady Macbeth is at the beginning most of the time, and then all of a sudden she disappears and goes crazy.
Hmm.
And then
Yep.
Macbeth kind of goes nuts, and then all of a sudden it's like, well, we're all against Macbeth, let's go kill him. So it's very straightforward, but there's a lot more like stuff happening, like very specific things, like anxiety inducing things, like about to murder the king, and are we going to get caught for it? And by the end, it's like, well, obviously we know he's doing bad things, so let's go get
Hmm.
him. And at that point it's like, all right, like let's kind of get it over with. There's no like
Yeah.
there's nothing compelling to bring forward. Also, I think there's such a darkness about this play that kind of
Hmm.
sometimes makes me feel physically uncomfortable at the end of it. And
Mm.
it could truly be like a cursed play.
Um, so it's interesting that you would bring these points up because I think you're right. I don't think you're incorrect in any of this analysis. I think productions enjoy it, to your point. Like the production I watched was one that came out of it was filmed from the BBC, and it had the guy from Doctor Who, one of the Doctor Who's in it, and one of the more recent Doctor Who's. Uh,
Oh, David Tennant, probably. He's done a lot of Shakespeare.
might have been him, but I might be wrong. My guests will, or my listeners will correct me on this. If it wasn't 10, it might. They're reaching out to me all the time. They're telling me, "Oh, no, no, you missed that one," and I could look it up, but I'm not going to do that right now. But it starred a guy from Doctor Who. It might have been Tennant, and it was done. Talk about modernizing it, right?
Mhm.
Everybody was dressed in modern costume. It was very and I've done some theatrical production work in my distant past. When I was in community college, I did some community theater stuff because I was a Bachelor of Fine Arts major. That's what I went to college for. I did not go to college for business or any of that other kind of stuff. And I came to that later on. But in my Bachelor of Fine Arts practice, I figured I needed to know something about theater production. So I did a little bit on some theater productions and went and saw some theater productions in New York City. And so the set design of it, which was fascinating to me, was very modernistic. Or postmodern, actually, which went along, of course, with the modern costuming, like Banquo and Macbeth when they're dressed as soldiers. They're very much dressed like they came out of the Iraq War. So it's a very contemporary, contemporization of Macbeth. So I think to your point about staging it, it's easy to stage. You don't have too many transitions. It works. You can kind of mold that a little bit. I also think you're correct in that um, there's a lack of, and we'll talk a little about this today, but particularly with Bradley's analysis of sort of Macbeth, but there's a lack of psychologizing around why Macbeth does the things that he does that because we live after the death of not the novel. Well, yeah, we live after the death of the novel because the novel's basically dead. I think, anyway. That's one of the things that one of the ideas that we explore on this show, not the book. That's why this show is called Leadership Lessons from the Great Books, not Leadership Lessons from the Great Novels. The book is still alive, but the novel itself has migrated to all these other spaces, right? So it's migrated to film very strongly. It's migrated to theater, where you came out of, or where you make your, made your bones. We think that it's, at least on this show, I think that it's migrated to social media, like all the things that a novel used to do, that interiority, like a good Jane Austen novel. Now we actually rely on streaming shows and movies to do that for us. So the novel's probably on its last legs. And you can disagree with me about that if you want, but Macbeth comes before all of that. And so you're right, we don't get interiority into Macbeth, or we don't get a psychological sort of analysis and a slicing of him. Um, we also don't get a psychological analysis and a slicing of Lady Macbeth. We have no idea well, not no idea. We have a limited idea of what her motivations are, only based on what the words are that Shakespeare put in her mouth. And again, we're post novel, right? We're also post feminism, which is a whole other kind of set of pieces of analysis around that. And so we're looking at it from different lenses, right? And so I agree with you. And then as far as the darkness piece, one of the things we really like as people, particularly postmodern people, is we like this idea that um, anybody can be redeemed at any time. And I was watching a recent movie that I was watching, Masters of the Universe. I don't know if you've seen that movie.
Is that the He-Man one?
Yes, He-Man and the
Yeah.
Masters of the Universe. Yeah.
I haven't seen that in a really long time, but I used to love um when I was a kid, it used to come on like, I don't know, channel 11 or something every
Yes.
year, and we like were like already around the TV with our popcorn. We're like, we're gonna watch Masters of the Universe. We were so excited. It was like an event in my household.
So the movie is interesting because it's sort of nostalgic bait for people like
Hmm.
you and I who remember this and sort of have these memories. But then it's also updated for like millennials and Gen Zers who have no concept of any of that and didn't get to experience that historically.
Hmm.
Um, and so one of the things that is interesting in that movie is Skeletor has a moment played by the Jared Leto crushed it as Skeletor. Oh
Uh,
my God, it's ridiculous. And he says something to He-Man in there that is so totally antithetical to our time. It took me by surprise that he actually said it out loud because He-Man's trying to, see if there's any good in him, if he can be turned, whatever. And Skeletor laughs, that cackle, and he goes, I just do evil stuff for evil's sake. I'm just
mhm.
evil. Like there's no great well of goodness inside of me somewhere. No, I'm evil. I do evil. He didn't say the curse word, but he's like, I do evil stuff. Like, that's what I do. I'm an evil guy. There's no other motivation other than that. And it was sort of weirdly refreshing to like hear that because that means that he's not redeemable. You gotta eliminate him, right? Kind of like the
Mhm.
Joker in the Dark Knight, the Dark Knight back in the day with Batman. But we struggle with this idea that people aren't redeemable. And so Macbeth challenges that because Macbeth is not redeemable. Macbeth does not get redeemed at the end. He just gets killed. And that's just it. So I agree with you. That does create a certain darkness 400 years later in the psyche of a Westerner when they read it. So I agree with all of your points. I'm fascinated by this because I think the lessons in here are really interesting from a tragic perspective. Because to your point, and I'm going to push back on this a little bit, I think we do actually have kings, but we call them
Mhm.
CEOs now.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah.
And we do have emperors, we call them prime ministers now. And we have these people that are playing at global levels in our world, but they don't seem to ever this is very broad. I'm going to open the door here. They don't ever seem to experience tragic circumstances like the rest of us. They seem to just sort of float above it all.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing that actually hooks us into Macbeth. It's sort of Schadenfreude for us
Hmm.
because we see like, I'll use a public example that everybody knows. Bill Gates' name was on the list of folks that went to Epstein Island.
Hmm.
People are still buying Microsoft products. We're recording this on a computer that is powered by Microsoft. There seems to have been no penalty for any of that.
Yeah.
And I think tragic narratives give us the ability, like Macbeth, give us the ability to sort of walk out all of those feelings of like frustration and anger and vengeance and desire for justice, to see things happen to people that we think deserve it. And that's why I think Macbeth still works. But I don't know if you, I don't know what you think about that. I don't
Oh
know.
yeah, I mean, I think obviously Macbeth still works, and like I see your point with CEOs and prime ministers and being those, what we have now today. I think the thing about Macbeth is that it's the succession of title kind of a thing, and like while
Okay.
there is some like type of nepotism sometimes within companies, it's not like, oh well, this person is going to get this kingship because they're next in line if
Hmm.
this person dies. So like if somebody's like, well, if I unless you're like, I'm the son and I'm going to go kill my dad because I want this CEO title. There's not like that type of succession in our public sphere that connects the same way as like, oh, if the king dies, then Macbeth is going to be next in line, right? So like,
Right.
oh, if this person dies, I'm going to be next in line. Which you know if people were smart, directors and people like that, they could make those kinds of connections within that
Hmm.
functionality. But I don't know if that's ever been done, or I feel like sometimes with Macbeth people just tend to get a little bit lazy
Hmm.
because it's like it's all just right there laid out for
Right
you,
there.
and maybe it's like maybe people are scared like, oh, we don't want to screw with Macbeth because like we don't want to mess with the story because it's so popular and everybody's familiar with it. Why change it? Which I get, familiarity, it's something that keeps the masses coming in. And I think sometimes
Hmm.
too, like those, it's gotta put the name on the marquee, right? Like, oh, Macbeth is coming. Like I know exactly what to expect when I'm going into Macbeth. I know what happens. I'm already prepared. I don't have to worry that I'm going to hate this play because I already know that I love it. I want to see what it's done with. And I think sometimes people go to see these Shakespeare shows because they want to see if what somebody else has done with the same
Instead
story.
with the same story. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but sometimes it's just, oh, I'm just going to keep doing the same thing and over and over again. And I like that you mentioned Shakespeare in modern clothes. I love when performances do that. And I think it's becoming
Hmm.
way more and more common, because that kind of connection to the audience, where you modernize the characters on stage, it makes the audience feel like they're living in the same timeline as the story that's being told. So
Hmm.
it makes that kind of visual connection to it. And that's, I think, important because if you think about it, the most accurate way to pay homage to Shakespeare's design is to be as simple as possible because he didn't have sets. The costumes that they wore were usually just, you know, hand me downs from people of higher status,
Hmm.
or they had specific costumes for, say, like the Roman plays or something. But most of the time, they would be wearing just regular Elizabethan garb, which is the same thing as their modern dress. So when we put these plays into our modern dress,
Hmm.
we're paying a better homage to Shakespeare in that way.
Okay, so let me ask you this question.
Yeah.
One of the pieces of pushback that I always get whenever I do Shakespeare, whether it's from or cover Shakespeare, whether it's from guests, and we'll get back to Macbeth in a minute,
Yeah.
whether it's from guests or whether it's from listeners, I always get this pushback, and I'm going to get this pushback on this episode too. If we can update the dress, which I agree with you, like I'm reading Coriolanus right now, and I didn't realize that they had turned that into a film with gosh, a few years ago. And so I went and looked at the trailer for that, and they're all in modern, garb. I think Gerard Butler is in that movie,
Hmm.
or the movie version of Coriolanus, right? Um, and so they're all not even in, they're not in Roman garb. They're in they're in modern warrior garb, right? They're dressed like soldiers from, again, the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, whatever these modern wars are that we've had. Okay. And so that connects to your point, that connects with the audience. But Ray Fiennes, that's who it is. Ray Fiennes and Gerard Butler, Fassbender, Maria or Marion Cotillard in Macbeth, the film version of Macbeth, which by the way, they weren't updated in their clothing. They kind of did the original thing. Okay, cool.
Hmm.
But they set it all in Scotland, so it's like in it that this the sets are the environment, which is kind of amazing. Um, but the pushback I get is you could update the clothes, but you can't update the language. Why are we saying these and thous? Why are we saying error and or and why are we doing this? Like, just make it English. That's
So
always the pushback I get. So go ahead and
yeah,
respond to that. Yeah.
and I'll definitely respond to that. So like
Hmm.
it is first of all, it is English. It is early modern English. So I know a lot of people say, "Oh, it's old English. I can't understand it." It is early modern English.
Yeah.
Most of the time written in iambic pentameter or other kinds of meter, sometimes in prose. I think people approach Shakespeare and they're so afraid of it because they're like, well, I don't understand what any of this means. It's just poetry. So it's
Yeah.
just poetry. So really, it's just heightened language. It was the language of the time. And I think the fun of it, for me anyway, is analyzing the text and trying to understand exactly what's being said and looking at all the rhetoric and using that towards performance. And it's you have to appreciate the beauty. And that's not to say you can't make a modern English version of Macbeth. You can, but then it
Mhm.
wouldn't be Shakespeare's Macbeth. It would be somebody else's interpretation of Macbeth, and therefore you'd have to license it from them. So it's just way easier to just use the original Macbeth because it's free to license. You could just do it, and it's poetry, and it's beautiful, and the language is lovely. And it's interesting looking at a lot of his other plays. I remember I was in like a Shakespeare survey class in my undergrad, and we were reading a variety of plays. We read Midsummer Night's Dream, we read Henry IV, we read Hamlet, we read The Tempest. There was one other that we read, but after I read Henry IV, part one, and then I immediately read Hamlet after that. And I was like, oh my God, he loved Hamlet. This was his magnum opus. The language in Hamlet is so much more heightened than the language in Henry IV. Henry IV is simpler. It's just kind of like whatever. There's a lot more prose, but in Hamlet, it is art. It is his masterpiece. It is, I think, one that he loved writing. So you can tell the difference. Like even in As You Like It, that play is like 90% prose. He was
Hmm.
just kind of like, and I think I've heard people joke like, oh, he wrote As You Like It because, and that's why he called it As You Like It, because it's like the audiences wanted more and more and more stuff. And he's like, well, here you go. Here's some crap that I just put out, you know? So it's like modern, like modern filmmakers, right? Like we got like a Steven Spielberg or something. In 400 years, people are going to look at Steven Spielberg the same way that we look at Shakespeare today. Shakespeare was just a popular playwright at the time,
Hmm.
and that was the common media. So like our common media today is film and television. Back
Hmm.
then it was plays and bear baiting, which was competing with, you could pay the same price to go see a play, or you could go down the street or across the street and go see a bear being attacked by dogs. So like it's just that was their entertainment for the time. And our entertainment for the time, Spielberg, not everything that he makes is a masterpiece. Like,
That is
sometimes
true. That
sometimes
is
he
true.
makes like stuff that's like, okay, this is for the common people, but then he makes bigger, more important, like Titanic is some like an
Yeah.
epic movie that he made. And then I forget, I can't think off the top of my head other things that he's made right
It's
now,
okay.
but
It's
you
okay.
you understand
Like
you
yeah,
understand
yeah, yeah.
the comparison there.
Oh yeah, Close Encounters of the Third Kind
Mm-hmm.
or E.T. the Extraterrestrial or the any of the Indiana Jones movies that he directed, any of the first three. I'm not talking about the last few. Those don't exist in this dojo. We don't talk about those. Um we don't talk about those. Um or or any of his historic epics. So Saving Private Ryan,
Hmm.
Schindler's List.
Yeah, I
Um,
thought he did Schindler's List. I
yeah,
just wasn't sure.
yeah. And Titanic was done by James Cameron, but that's
Oh, James
okay.
Cameron, duh.
That's okay. That's all right. That's all right. That's all right. You on that one, you can kind of flip flop them. They're both doing. I mean, it's fine. My point is, and I get your point. Those he's going to do those kinds of films, but then he's going to, oh, for lack of a better term, he's going to push out something like Disclosure Day, which just came out,
Hmm.
and it's like, maybe you're done, Stephen. Maybe it's time to be done. And maybe that's okay. Like it's like Eminem would maybe say back in the day, like it's okay to be done. Um, okay. Uh, Before we go back to Macbeth, one other point, and I want to find out from you. We don't often talk about who Shakespeare was as a creative on this show, because we just make an assumption, and probably an erroneous one, that most people just know who Shakespeare is. But you're the Shakespeare expert. Talk to us about who Shakespeare was. Talk to us about sort of what kind of creative was he? What was he seeking to do with his plays? Was he seeking to, as Steve Jobs would say, make a dent in the universe, or was he just seeking to like entertain people?
So that's the great mystery. So we can't know what his intentions were. We can make assumptions, we can make speculations, but we're never going to know how he was as a creative. Um, the only thing that we have a record of really is his plays, and we can't assume that he was trying to say anything with them. We can't assume that the characters that were in the plays represented a part of himself. We can look at the sonnets and make assumptions, but we can never know because none of us were there. So that's really the great mystery. I wish I had more information for you. Like there are, books written. Uh, Paul Menzer, who was one of the professors at the Shakespeare and Performance Program, he was a previous director, and he actually was just recently selected as the inaugural chair in Shakespeare Studies at the Folger Library.
Hmm.
Um, he wrote a book, and I think it was called Shakespeare: A Life. So it's
Hmm.
let me just look that up real quick.
Sure.
He he wrote that, and I think I haven't read it yet. Um, but that I think is the closest thing we're really going to get as to his intentions. We can look into what was happening in the Elizabethan and Jacobean periods at the time, the Elizabethan worldview, and kind of try to like put the pieces together as to what he was trying to say. But we're never going to really know it, it
Hmm.
in terms of like his creativity and what he was trying to do with it. My assumption, he's just trying to make some money. Like, and he
Hmm.
was an artist, his father was a glove maker. Um, we don't know if his father wanted him to also continue in the line of glove making. Maybe, I don't know. These are all just speculations and assumptions, and you can use your imagination and kind of think. Um, see, see. Sorry, I'm just
No, you're fine.
A Brief Life. William Shakespeare, A Brief Life. He wrote that in 2023.
Okay.
It's kind of talks about kind of like tracking Shakespeare's life as much as we possibly can. So if you
Hmm.
want to understand maybe a little bit more about Shakespeare's life and his creativity and what influenced him, that might be a really good place to start in reading that book. Um, so to repeat, it is William Shakespeare: A Brief Life by Dr. Paul Menzer.
Got it. Yeah, we'll put a link to that book in the show notes
Yeah.
for this episode. Yeah. Um all right, let's go ahead and let's go back to the play. Let's pick up a little bit here from Act 1 Scene 5, and then we're going to skip and we're going to go to Scene 7. We're going to talk about a person who I think is probably the most compellingly interesting person in the entire play, but not for the obvious reasons that you may think. So let's pick up with Macbeth. We're still in Act 1, Scene 5. Enter Macbeth's wife alone with a letter. Lady Macbeth reading the letter. They met me in the day of success, and I have learned by the perfectest report that they have more in them than mortal knowledge. When I burned in desire to question them further, they made themselves air into which they vanished. Whilst I stood wrapped in the wonder of it, came missives from the king, who all hailed me Thane of Cawdor, by which title before these weird sisters saluted me, and referred me to the coming on of time with Hail King that shall be. This I have thought good to deliver thee, my dearest partner of greatness, that thou mightest not lose the dues of rejoicing by being ignorant of what greatness is promised to thee. Lay it to thy heart, and farewell. Glamis thou art, and Cawdor, and shalt be what thou art promised. Yet do I fear thy nature. It is too full of the milk of human kindness to catch the nearest way. Thou wouldest be great, art now, without ambition, but without the illness should attend it. What thou wast highly, that thou wast thou holily, would thou not play false, and yet wouldst wrongly win. Thou'st have great Glamis, that which cries, Thus thou must do, if thou have it, and that which rather thou dost fear to do, than wishest should be undone. Hie thee hither, that I may pour my spirits in thine ear, and chastise with the valor of my tongue all that impedes thee from the golden round, which fate and metaphysical aid doth seem to have thee crowned withal. Enter messenger. What is your tidings? Messenger. The king comes here tonight. Lady Macbeth. Thou art mad to say it. Is not thy master with him, who were so would have informed for preparation? Messenger. So please you, it is true, our Thane is coming. One of my fellows had the speed of him, who, almost dead for breath, had scarcely more than would make up this message. Lady Macbeth, get him tending. He brings great news. Messenger exits. The raven himself is hoarse that croaks the fatal entrance of Duncan under my battlements. By the way, pause. I love that line, by the way. And I love that line. Back to the play. Come, you spirits that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here, and fill me from the crown to the toe, top full of direst cruelty. Make thick my blood, stop up the access and passage to remorse, that no compunctions, visitings of nature shake my fell purpose, nor keep peace between the effect and it. Come to my woman's breasts and take my milk for gall, you murdering ministers, wherever in your sightless substances you wait on nature's mischief. Come, thick night, and pall thee in the dunnest smoke of hell, that my keen knife see not the wound it makes, nor heaven peep through the blanket of the dark to cry, Hold, hold! Enter Macbeth. Great Glamis, worthy Cawdor, greater than both by the all hail hereafter. Thy letters have transported me beyond this ignorant present, and I feel now the future in the instant. Macbeth. My dearest love, Duncan comes here tonight. Lady Macbeth. And when goes hence? Macbeth. Tomorrow, as he purposes. Lady Macbeth. Oh, never shall sun that morrow see. Your face, my Thane, is as a book where men may read strange matters. To beguile the time looks like the time. Pause. I love that word beguile, by the way. Love that word. Back to it. Bear welcome in your eye, your hand, your tongue. Look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it. He that's coming must be provided for, and you shall put this night's great business into my dispatch, which shall, to all our nights and days to come, give solely sovereign sway and masterdom. Macbeth. We will speak further. Lady Macbeth. Only look up clear. To alter favor ever is to fear. Leave all the rest to me. They exit. I'm going to stop there. It's a lot to read, and I'm not Shakespearean enough probably for it. Lady Macbeth is probably the most interesting character in this entire tragedy. Um, when I first encountered her, I immediately thought of all of the female CEOs I've ever heard of. I immediately thought of Oprah. I immediately thought of Martha Stewart. I immediately thought of the social media exaggeration of the boss babe, in air quotes, right? That floats around social media. Um, and I don't know why those associations came unbidden into my brain, but reading the words of Lady Macbeth and how she was written, particularly when she talks about dashing a child's head, against a rock, right? Or the milk of human kindness turning to gall in her breast. When I read these things, I immediately think of, oh, she is a fully and totally empowered woman. Macbeth isn't telling her what to do. The man is not telling her what to do. She's not okay. Modern feminist theory would say she's operating under a patriarchy, and isn't it terrible? Except that's not the way Shakespeare wrote her, at least not in the first part of the play, to Katie's point. We'll talk about the second part of the play in a minute. A.C. Bradley, in his famous book of essays on Shakespearean tragedies, asserted, and I agree with this, that Lady Macbeth was driven by courage and force of will, but that such drives came from a lack of imagination and left her unable to repent of her deeds when they visited her again. Now, the fact is that we look at people like this, like Lady Macbeth, and she could stand as an avatar for a lot of other people in our modern era, and we wonder where their imagination is. Like we already mentioned the rich guys, right? But what about the rich guys' wives? What about Melinda Gates? What about Mackenzie Bezos? What about Hillary Clinton? What about Nancy Pelosi? Where is the milk of human kindness, or is it turned to gall? Where are these things, right, that we expect from women leaders? The canard is always, if women were in charge, everything would be better. Lady Macbeth kind of puts paid to that a little bit. I don't think everything would be better. I just think it would be the same nonsense we just have differently. But I want to know what Katie thinks about Lady Macbeth. And I'm going to ask her this question. What can leaders, female or male, we're going to be agnostic on this, we're going to unsex this question, such as it were. What can they learn from her example? Go ahead, Katie.
All right. So first, I do want to kind of like I'm gonna like tangent off of this because
Absolutely.
there's a lot of historical context associated with who Lady Macbeth represented. So I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but Macbeth was written essentially to flatter King James. He had
Yep.
just ascended to the throne a few years ago, a few years prior to this coming out. Banquo essentially represents, the line of Scottish kings. It's flattering him, and that it plays with his obsession and fear of witchcraft and the occult, and then also it was associated with the gunpowder plot. Now, the gunpowder plot, if that was the Guy Fawkes thing where they all planned together. But I so just for background, my master's thesis, I did my master's thesis about it was a feminist sorry, it was a view of Shakespeare's female characters,
Hmm.
but it was a comparison of the ones he wrote when Elizabeth was queen versus the ones he wrote when James was in power. And if
Interesting.
you
Okay.
look and if you look at those women that when James was in power, they were much more villainized. So, in going back to the gunpowder plot, I was in my thesis research. I was reading a chapter in Frances E. Dolan's book, "Whores of Babylon: Catholicism, Gender, and 17th Century Print Culture," and she theorizes that the idea of the gunpowder plot was heavily connected to the threat of Catholicism, because I believe the people who were planning the gunpowder
Hmm.
plot were Catholics, which the Protestants at the time, the rulers, did not like the Catholics. They were persecuted. They hated anything to do with Catholicism. But with Catholicism, held with it the fear of the inversion of the gender hierarchy, and thus the disruption of the social order. So, in theory, because Catholics put women on top, meaning, women were more in charge and men were in the subordinate role, the women were supposedly influencing their men to kill James. Does that
Okay.
sound familiar in terms of
Hmm.
the plot of Macbeth?
Hmm.
So, Lady
Okay.
Macbeth, in my opinion, represents this subversion from these gender norms and capitalizes on the fear of her emasculating Macbeth and having him taking a subordinate role to her, as well as James's fear of feminine power deposing his masculine rule, especially with him taking the throne after 44 years of a female monarch.
Hmm.
So with that being said, I find it very fascinating that you refer to her as a boss babe, because I usually associate that term with a woman who is kind of taking her life into her own hands and creating something positive despite that patriarchal undertones of society, right? Like starting a small business or something, not regicide. Um, not to say that, not to say Lady Macbeth did not take things into her own hands. She did,
Sure.
and then those hands were then covered in blood for the rest of the play. But if you consider that historical context,
Hmm.
she is, in my personal opinion, written as
Hmm.
the main antagonist of the play.
Hmm.
It is her
Okay.
decision to kill Duncan that drives the plot forward. So Macbeth would have otherwise accepted his fate regardless of his actions. He didn't have to do anything to earn Saint of Cawdor. He has a conversation with himself in Act One, Scene Three, where
Hmm.
he's like, "All right, what should I do? Should I take any actions?" And then he decides to himself, "If chance will have me king, while chance may crown me without my stir." So he has already decided for himself, all right, I'm not going to do anything because obviously I didn't have to do anything to get Thane of Connor. I'm just going to excitedly tell my wife, hey, this happened. Guess what? And for some reason, upon reading the letter, Lady Macbeth has already decided that the only possible way forward now is obviously we have to kill the king, right? Like that's a very unreasonable thing. And this is our first impression of her, right?
Hmm.
So the way it's written in that way, like she's wants to rule and she wants it now. She wants it, she sees her future in the instant, and she's ruthless. Whether or not that's influenced by the supernatural. So like you could say, well, maybe like the witches enchanted the letter that went to Lady Macbeth, and that could be some kind of reasoning as to what happens. But we will never know because we can't really do psychological realism on these characters. Um, but she knows that Macbeth is too full of the milk of human kindness to get the job done, right? She also
Right.
knows, but she also notes that he's not without ambition, the illness, but he's without the illness that should attend it. So she's referencing ambition as being sick, and she's passing that sickness on to Macbeth, like in her pep talk to him in 1-7, she tears him to pieces. She emasculates
Hmm.
him. You're like, you're not a man if you can't do this. And the talk about her bashing the child's brain in, she's saying essentially like, if you, what did she say? I would have just, I would have sacrificed the life of my child before I backed out on this deal between you and me, because you and me, we are a unit, we are a team.
So I, so I'm glad you brought all this up because 17th century England and Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and remember I said at the beginning, like I try to look at things within the context of the century
Yeah.
that they are in, right? That was much more of a warrior ethos kind of culture than even we have now. I mean, at that point in time on the European continent, there had been 1,000 years of war since the end of the Roman Empire. The Carolingians came in, the invasion of well, not the invasion of Normandy, but the Norman invasion of France had occurred, right? Where, the English were trying to get the French to do certain things, and the French were like, sacre bleu, and trying to run them off the continent. We hadn't yet made the turn into what we tend to think of as the modern world, because the Renaissance hadn't quite washed up on the shores of England. We actually read Francis Bacon, The Great Instauration, at the beginning of this year. And I'm fascinated by Francis Bacon because he's the first, for lack of a better term, he's the first shot across the bow of the Age of Enlightenment in England. He's where that sort of really begins to really sort of click in where, oh, science can be the thing that drives us rather than, to your point, religious fervor or any of these kinds of things. And it isn't, I don't remember this, but isn't part of the plot of Shakespeare in Love that like Francis Bacon was really Shakespeare or something like that? I heard that theory somewhere, or maybe I'm confusing two things together in my head. I very
I
well
think
might be.
he was it. One of the things is Shakespeare was actually the Earl of Oxford, and that like there's like a whole Oxfordian and like the Stratfordian things. It's
Yeah, okay.
crazy.
Right. That's what I'm okay. Yeah. Again, multiple things sort of flopping around together in my head there. And so when I look at that world, um, on the one hand, you could say, wouldn't it have been great if women were treated equally then? Yeah, it would have been great. I don't know what that would have meant in that culture, and at that time, um, because we look at that through the lens of industrialization and a whole bunch of assumptions that, quite frankly, if we took them back 400 years, would seem weird to those people. Like they wouldn't be able to wrap their arms around those assumptions because there's too much water under the bridge. Um, I also think that to your point about not being able to psychologically examine our characters, I think we read something like this and it seems weird to us because we don't know kind of what their psychology was. And of course, psychology didn't exist then. So, I'm not saying they didn't have an understanding of interiority. They did, but they were also, to your point, navigating all of the sort of spiritual and religious elements that were around them. Because I think they also lived in a world that was much more not focused, but a lot more familiar. That's the term I'm going to use. There's a lot more familiar with the sacred in ways that we have sort of abandoned for good or ill, and we talk about that on the show all the time. But that we have abandoned in our time, 400 years later. So I think you kind of got to put some of that context around it. I find it interesting, though, that, and maybe this is the question. I guess I'll frame what I find interesting as a question. So when I saw the two performances, or watched the two performances that I watched of Lady Macbeth, one from Marion Cotillard and then the other one from the David Tennant version of Macbeth. What struck me was in the stage version, she was much more what I would associate boss babe-ish. She came off much more as I'm gonna run this thing. I'm gonna run this town, to paraphrase from Jay-Z.
Hmm.
Um, Whereas in the film version, she was much more, while vicious, much more subdued. Now, that could just be different actresses just interpreting it differently, which I'll grant that. But I find it interesting that there's enough meat there, at least in the first part of her appearance in the play. There's enough meat there to kind of get that continuum inside of that character, which is why I find her to be interesting because the well, what are the associations? Let me frame this as a question. I'm finally going to get to the question. what are the what are the associations we could make with Lady Macbeth, at least in the first part of the play? And we'll get to the second part of the play in just a second here. But what are the associations we could make with her? Should we should we hold her to be a villain, or should we be more forgiving of her?
I think that we can be more. So I was giving the background of historical context
Yeah,
just in reference to the boss babe thing. So, and
yeah,
in reference to like leadership qualities.
yeah.
Um, I think we could definitely like view her in either way. Like, so the same way, like you said, that these two actresses played her differently, a director could have a different vision for what story he wants told there. So he could say, I want to frame Lady Macbeth as the villain in this because I want to, which is essentially what, the original intent could have been was we're going to show King James, oh, obviously women and the associations with witchcraft, like they're bad, don't let a woman be in control, obviously, because, men are better leaders. So that was kind of like that lesson, I guess you could say, that was to
Mhm.
be taken from this play for King James. Like, it was still all entertainment. Like I said, this play was written to flatter him. It was obviously
Right.
also like a good drama for other people
Mhm.
to watch. Um, but in terms of relating to the time period, like and it really like how some plays or some movies play off of current events,
Yeah.
kind of. So it was the play off of the gunpowder plot. So like taking some of those themes, like, oh, this we don't like Catholics, so don't let your women control you, kind of a thing. But to go back to Lady Macbeth in our modern era, we obviously don't have to take any of that information and use it towards her performance. We can look at her as like a good, powerful, strong character. She's a great character. I would love to play her one day. She's a coveted role for many a Shakespearean actress because she has all that meat and her language is so rich and she's so powerful. But in terms of leadership qualities, Lady Macbeth in the context of the play, in the context of the time period, as you said, you like to look at things within the context of the time period that they're written. She's playing the patriarchal game and she's lusting for power and prominence through Macbeth's promised position of king. So Tina Packer, who was, and she just recently passed away, she was the founding artistic director of the Shakespeare and Company, and she was a prolific um, director and actress and Shakespeare. In her book, Women of Will, which she talks about her experience with every single one of Shakespeare's women, that Lady Macbeth, like other women at the time married to men in prominent positions, or even modern times where, maybe we have some women who still feel like they can't, you know, be equal to the men that they're with. She joined with their husband's ambition, empowering their men to get further than they could themselves. So she is kind of living vicariously through Macbeth in these instances because she can't do it on her own. She's not in a social position to get what she wants. But Packer says the story of Macbeth is the story of what happens when a powerful woman loses herself and plays the patriarchal game. It ends in fascism.
Hmm.
So the lesson to be learned needs to be kind of treaded a little bit lightly, right? So we currently live in a patriarchal society, which has been recently exacerbated by current leadership. We're going back in time in terms of women's rights in some instances. So if we want to look to Lady Macbeth as an example of leadership and what we can learn from this today, we need to be really careful about how we handle it, considering the historical context of what feels a little anti-feminine. So we could simply say we need to look at not being blinded by our own ambition and losing ourselves in the rabble. But it doesn't have to be that simple. Like I said, witchcraft was so often connected with women not adhering to their gender roles. Even in the beginning of Macbeth, Banquo says, "Are you women? Your beards would make me call you otherwise." So they're kind of like androgynous creatures, like because true women, in the eyes of Protestant um, early modern England at the time, were supposed to adhere to specific gender roles. They didn't always, obviously, like you have laws and rules today, but people do whatever they want. They just pay
Hmm.
fines for it, right? But James's obsession with witchcraft may have been incredibly influential to Shakespeare and essentially designed the fate of Lady Macbeth as somewhat of a warning to the perils of women in power. We don't want to take that lesson. Contrarily, it may have also been a lesson for the men as to what happens when your masculine and your feminine powers are not balanced, meaning the hierarchy is swapped, like which we said was anti-Catholic fear, right? So, but for our modern listeners, the balance of feminine and masculine powers should not be interpreted as external, but internal, right? So, in order to be a great leader, you need to be a balanced leader. You need to balance your ambition with your humanity. You need to be both strong and soft. You need to have a tender listening ear as well as a strong moral judgment. Otherwise, it could devolve into chaos and anarchy and mutiny. And, obviously, we saw the fate of the Macbeths. So we want to, do we want to take what face value what Lady Macbeth is doing at the beginning of the play, especially considering what happens to her at the end?
So there's an element here that we also miss in thinking about this that I would like to
Mm-hmm.
throw into the pot as well, which
Yeah.
suddenly occurred to me when we were talking, or when you were talking. Um, we don't talk a lot in our modern times about the nature of marriage between men and women. We actually don't talk a lot about that. We talk a lot
No.
about divorce. We talk a lot about divorce. We talk a lot about separation. We talk a lot about single parents. We talk a lot about step parents. We talk about same-sex parents. We talk a lot about all these other kinds of different arrangements. But it is almost deafening, the lack of noise around. And I'm married. I've been married for many years. I don't know if you're married or not, but we'll just leave that aside for
I
a
am,
second.
yeah.
Okay, all right. So being married in a to frame it in modern, postmodern terms, a long-term committed relationship with children and property and all of these other kinds of things going on, and been married for a long time and planning on staying married for a long time. We don't talk about the dynamics of what happened between men and women in marriage. And Macbeth,
Hmm.
Shakespeare touched on this. He didn't specifically put his whole hand on it because that might have been too much for him, and maybe he didn't need to because everyone in the crowd who was watching the play, even including the king, knew what the deal was. So they had a different set of social assumptions than what we
Hmm.
have, right?
Yes.
Um, and you could talk about the Catholic Church and the Catholics versus the Protestants and the Protestant Reformation, which had started in 15 whatever with Martin Luther and had spread across the continent and it's proceeded to rack and ruin religion, along with the printing press, by the way, which allowed all of these kinds of dynamics around Protestantism to spread. Without the printing press, there would have been no Protestantism. It wouldn't have happened. And so you have a situation where people are knowing what the deal is. The church has already explained to them for 1,000 years what the deal is with marriage, and people just accept it. They're just like, okay, this is fine. So he wouldn't have had to explain it
No.
because we live after all of that. And we do live in an era where women vote. There is literally no door, and I have daughters too. There's literally no door closed to women. There's literally no door. You can walk through any door you want. Now, what happens after you walk through that door? That's a different thing altogether. But you do have the option to walk through that door. Um, because of a country that didn't exist during Shakespeare's time called the United States of America, where we just sort of took all of the we did. We took all the Enlightenment promises and we kind of pushed. We have been for the last 250 years of our existence. We've been pushing them all the way out further and further and further. You can see this in the expansion of the franchise, who gets to vote, who doesn't, all these kinds of things, right? All the kinds of arguments we have here, we wouldn't have had. They didn't have in England. Again, going back to what I said previously, the previous segment, they wouldn't have understood what we were even talking about. It wouldn't have like natural rights of man. What? I don't know what even that means, right? So we start from a different set of assumptions looking at Lady Macbeth. But we also start from a different set of assumptions looking at the marriage of the two of them.
Hmm.
And I think that this is really one of the key things. You asked why Macbeth is still popular. I think this is the thing we can't put our hands on. We don't have a good way, particularly in our movies, because again, remember I said our novels have all gone to our movies now. When was the last good movie you saw about what happens in a person's marriage? Not their divorce, not the breakup, the actual marriage itself.
Yeah, I don't know because that's not something that's like,
Right, yeah,
present in
but
my mind, right?
right,
Because
yeah.
we know what happens in a marriage. It's the thing is, it's not compelling. It's not exciting. Like it's just like, oh, we're married. It's just no big deal. Like so that's why it doesn't really show up in a lot of stories. I
Except
think,
it is
yeah,
compelling.
yeah,
Except it is compelling. Like I think about the way my wife talks to me, not about murdering a king that may come visit in my house. We're not there, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. But the way she talks to me about picking up the groceries. I'll use something very simple. Picking up the groceries. We had a conversation today on the phone, pardon me, 15 minutes about picking up the groceries. There's all kinds of dynamics going on in that 15-minute
hmm,
conversation that if I were to novelize those or turn those into a play, I'm not saying my wife is Lady Macbeth, not even close, nor am I saying I'm Macbeth. but it touches on dynamics of how do I persuade and convince my husband to take action? How do I push back and resist my wife if I don't want to take action? How am I gradually persuaded and convinced to take action? How is she gradually persuaded and convinced to take action? Because by the way, just so you know the full, like some of the full stack of the dynamics in there, we've also got a home renovation going on. We've got
Hmm.
like three kittens living on our back porch that came out of nowhere. We've got, kids getting ready to go back to school. We've got a vacation coming up. My wife was sick over the weekend. I'm just getting over being sick. I had a death in the family recently, a sibling, we've got birthdays coming up, literally three birthdays, bang, 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 bang in a row while we're out of town. We're traveling. There's a lot of dynamics going on. All of that is, to paraphrase from Bob McKee, who I mentioned at the beginning in the open here, that's all human drama.
Hmm.
And it's all layered underneath there in a 15-minute conversation about groceries. The fact that we can't find drama in that stuff is a sad commentary on our time, not on Shakespeare, because Shakespeare
Hmm.
could find the drama in it. We can't find it? What are we doing?
And we're finding more and more sensationalized things to talk about. I think we're losing the connection with like just living because we're not living. We're trying to survive. We're trying to like get through this hellscape together. So like all of the things we don't have time to think about, oh, how nice it is to be married and look at all the fun things, that's happening in the dynamic with my marriage. People, I mean, and maybe maybe that will like calm people down, but like most of the time people want to be distracted. So they want
Mm-hmm.
distraction from real life now because real
Mm-hmm.
life is too heavy to bear. So so like having those like, oh, we're gonna, watch a husband and a wife have a conversation for for the people involved, it's very exciting because obviously
Mm-hmm.
you love this person, but for
Right.
outside people, it's like, I don't care about groceries right now. The world is on fire, so that's where we're losing that
And
in
this
our
is
modern time.
well, and this ties back to something that I said at the beginning, right? My opening.
Yeah.
We are so confronted in our algorithm with tragic circumstances,
Hmm.
and yet we struggle to put a narrative to those circumstances. Just like to your point you just made, we are struggling with all of these externalities that it could be argued historically have always been there, but let's just leave it at that. We're struggling with all these externalities, which is the same thing as tragic circumstances. Let's just put it all in the same box, right? But we don't have a creative narrative structure to make meaning or significance or sense of these things. And I think that this is
Hmm.
what Shakespeare does so brilliantly, and this is why Macbeth survives, along with Othello and King Lear and Hamlet, right? Like the Iago in Othello.
I I could go on a 3 hour tangent on how much I love Othello because first of all, the story is so compelling.
Mm-hmm.
Iago is the perfect villain because Iago is like, he's a guy you would meet on the street.
Mm-hmm.
He's so charming. And I think one of and I'll say this now, and I'll try not to go on a tangent because I could talk about Iago forever. I think one of the things that happens in casting of Iago is that they always make him much older than he is canonically. In the play, he's like 27 or 28 years old.
Mm-hmm.
You see a young man like that, you don't assume he's a terrible person. He's probably handsome. He's charming. Everybody calls him honest Iago. Like he's just a guy, but he's just a guy with a vengeance for no reason. He's just a piece of crap, like, and I love that play because it is it is so it is so salient true to life. And that's what
Mm-hmm.
I'm missing in Macbeth is that
Okay.
true, that like connection of like this particular character is so strongly well written, and he talks to the audience and he's like, and you can't lie in a soliloquy, so everything he's telling the audience is true. Therefore the audience is now complicit in whatever Iago's up to because they're not stopping it. right? They're allowing it to happen.
So Iago is a better looking version of The Underground Man in Notes from the Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky.
I
And I don't know
assume.
if you, right.
I have
And I
not
don't
read
know if
it.
you ever read it. If you, Notes from the Underground is very, very small. We covered it on the show a couple months ago. Very small book, but the kind of not sociopathic. I won't use that. Well, yeah, actually, no, that's the correct term. The kind of
Yeah, he's a sociopath.
the kind of sociopathic bitterness and hatred that Dostoevsky described in Notes from the Underground, that just with a better face on it, with a better looking, a 27-year-old, hardcore. I always think of Iago as, to your point, I always think of Iago as a supermodel. I always do. I always
Hmm.
put those two things in my head, right? Visually stunning, compelling, but with, to your point, this thing that's in the underground man, this bitterness and this hatred,
Hmm.
and at the end of the day, which we kind of now analyzed underground notes from the underground. You should go back and listen to that episode if you haven't, folks. Um, Iago, just like the underground man, hates himself,
Hmm. Oh yeah.
and that's the key to the whole thing. He hates himself, just and so he's going to punish everybody else because he hates himself, which of course leads to tragic circumstances. I think that story resonates deeply with folks in our time, particularly with how um, pervasive social media scrolling is, doom scrolling, um just consistently sitting there watching other people's lives, with of course tragedies interspersed here and there. You go from a flood in the Philippines, an earthquake in Japan, famine in Peru, to,
Hmm.
oh, there's Dave Goggins yelling at me that I'm weak, to who will carry the logs, to Two and a Half Men, to, hey, there's a Shakespeare performance. Oh, hey, there's the guy from Doctor Who. Oh, hey, there's my mom. Oh, hey, there's a grandma. Like, you're just, and there's no, we're being flooded algorithmically, and
Hmm.
our dopaminergic receptors are being flooded with all of this stuff. And this is why it's not narrative, it's just content, which
Hmm.
is where, a director like Martin Scorsese has a problem. And I agree with him. Things aren't just content, they actually have meaning, right? And significance. And so you look at Othello, and when Othello, to your point, when Iago in Othello does his soliloquy and talks to the audience, we've covered Othello on this show. You should go listen to that episode as well. When Iago does his soliloquy and sort of talks about his interiority, that immediately connects with a modern audience. Whereas, to your point about Lady Macbeth, we want to put her in a different kind of box, and she resists that. And then
Hmm.
the marriage piece, to your point, also we find dull and uninteresting. But that's the whole thing. That's what the play turns on, is their marriage.
Yeah.
If Macbeth weren't married to Lady Macbeth,
He
to your
could have.
point, he wouldn't have done
He
anything.
Yeah. We didn't done anything.
He wouldn't have done anything. And so the marriage the is where the drama is occurring. But in our time, that's been denatured and been pulled apart and
Hmm.
been drained of meaning. Um, and let's talk about just very briefly Lady Macbeth sort of at the end. So she goes through her character arc, which I will say this, and this is my critique to Shakespeare on this. Um, he didn't. I don't know if he got bored, or if he didn't know how to close the deal, or if he was distracted by 10,000 other things. I have no idea. Or maybe his wife was yelling at him about something. I don't know. But he didn't close the arc with her well. So there, I would normally say there's no denouement for Lady Macbeth, but there is, but it's kind of for what he sets up at the beginning, it's a weak sauce denouement. It doesn't allow her the, and maybe this is a modernist way of looking at it too. I'll grant you that. It doesn't allow her the sound and fury, right?
Hmm.
If I were to, if I were, oh my gosh, here we go. If I were to write Lady Macbeth as a character, she'd be swinging the sword right next to Duncan, or right, or
Hmm.
no, trying to kill Duncan, um, right along with everybody else out in the, like she'd be out there in the field. Now, maybe I've seen too many Marvel movies with, 90-pound women kicking the butts of 250-pound men. Maybe I have. Maybe that's a thing that I need to like overcome, right? Maybe that's not reality. Maybe it's always Eva Perón, don't cry for me, Argentina. Meanwhile, all the men go out and die. Maybe it always is that. Maybe it is Imelda Marcos. Maybe it is, you know, I mentioned Nancy Pelosi as a female leader. I mentioned Hillary Clinton. Maybe it is, we're going to run for these things. We're going to attain this political power, and all these men are going to serve us. And then they are going to go out and fight the wars, and they are going to die because we can't do it. We're not doing it. If Hillary Clinton had been president, there's no way in hell she would have been on the front line serving in Iraq when it happened. I mean, yes, she's also a 70-year-old woman. Don't get me wrong. I know what I'm saying here. But even at like 25, let's be intellectually honest, she wouldn't have been out there. Okay. There's a reason for that. And maybe that is the ultimate sort of end for Lady Macbeth, as she's standing on top of the battlements, watching the battle happen and watches her husband, get cut down. But instead, what we get from Shakespeare is not that. What we get from Shakespeare is what, Katie? What do we get from Shakespeare on Lady Macbeth? How does her arc end?
So Lady Macbeth, after the banquet, where she still once again still emasculating Macbeth, telling him, "Oh, stop being a little sissy, like man up." Like she's always telling him to man up. Then she just disappears, and then the next time she's revealed, she's sleepwalking and hallucinating about the blood on her hands. And then it is assumed that she commits suicide, um, but it's only an assumption based on something that Macduff says at the end of
Hmm.
the play, right, where this fiend like queen has undone herself.
Hmm.
So once again, going back to the historical context of it, if we are to look at Lady Macbeth as a villain, she wouldn't have deserved in Shakespeare's time, like in this particular um, contextual, in this particular play, in the context of what he was writing here for James, she wouldn't have deserved that going out with a blaze of glory. Like suicide was her, you know, unaliving, and it didn't even happen on stage. So this was an offstage
Hmm.
thing, and suicide in that time was illegal. Like
Hmm.
you wouldn't get a Christian burial. You would be
Hmm.
kind of like put out in like the stock, like just kind of buried wherever. Like you would get like the worst kind of treatment. But
Right.
because she was clinically insane, essentially, that would have been a way to kind of like get her that Christian burial. So she still gets this thing where it's like, okay, she committed suicide, but that's because she was crazy. But she doesn't get this blaze of glory because she's already a villain. So she, in that term of that context of like this, evil woman, you don't deserve it. We don't care about you anymore. We want to see what happens to the traitor, right?
So I immediately, you said Blaze of Glory twice, and it clicked something over my head. Did you ever watch the HBO show Game of Thrones?
I did not. No,
Okay.
I didn't have HBO. I know
Okay.
it's gotten
That's all right.
so
That's all
far
right.
into the seasons. I'm like, I can't
Okay.
start
No, no,
it.
no. That's okay. You're missing nothing. I'm not talking about House of Dragon. House of the Dragon, that's the
Hmm.
sequel spin-off thing. No, no, the original Game of Thrones. So I'm not going to give the spoiler alert. I'm not going to give away the way that it ends. But my wife and I watch this show. And I will say two things about Game of Thrones, which is the first time I've ever mentioned it on this show, which is kind of amazing in all the years I've done it. I should have stumbled on this earlier. But Game of Thrones, the reason I watched Game of Thrones was because number one, it was probably the greatest example of organizational behavior in action that I'd seen on TV in a while. And there's things you can do in that show because it's fantasy, 16th century fantasy with dragons, but it's fantasy, right? So you could do things in that context that you couldn't do in a show like, I don't know, The Sopranos, or something that's more grounded in reality, right? Or the way we conceive of reality. But then the second reason that I was interested in Game of Thrones was because the woman who's the queen of the dragons, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah, I
Yeah.
know. I know I've from the clips that I've seen online about Daenerys, like I'm like she is
Yeah.
like she's a powerful, strong
Powerful, strong woman
woman.
with an 800-ton dragon, actually
Yeah.
with like two 800-ton dragons. Um, that's Lady Macbeth's end.
Yeah. I mean, that would have been really cool. Like, I think for a modern audience, they'd be like, yeah, I want to see, like, because Lady Macbeth is such a compelling character in the beginning and she's so
Yeah.
strong and, like, forward, like, she is progressive in terms of, like, what we see women today, right?
Mm,
Um, but yeah, it would have been nice. But unfortunately, Shakespeare probably was like, well, because I've already villainized her, she doesn't deserve, the big send off. Like he's
hmm
written women who have been out in the battlefield. Like Queen
hmm
Margaret in Henry Six Part Three is like has York down and like essentially is like orders him orders his head to be chopped off because he's
hmm
a traitor. Like in the beginning of that play, Henry is like, oh, I failed by giving the succession to the Yorks, and she's like, well, you suck. I'm taking my son, and we're going to lead the army. So like
Yeah.
that's it's not that he isn't capable of writing characters like this because obviously he has done it before, but for the context of what he was writing. And especially I
hmm
think Henry 6 3 was during Elizabeth's reign. So like
It
all
was
of those
living. Yeah.
female characters would have been a lot
Right.
stronger back then.
Yeah.
So she just gets the suicide because it's like, all right, well, her part has been played. We don't need to worry about her anymore. She has no more influence on Macbeth because now he's like, well, Macbeth doesn't even need her anymore,
Right.
right?
One of my other guests who's actually coming on, he's going to do Coriolanus with us. He said something to me very interesting in a chat. We're kind of going back and forth, and it is something that applies here. He said, it's always interesting when commerce, not like when commerce warps art. And in Shakespeare's time, it wasn't so much commerce as it was politics
Mm-hmm.
warping art, right? And I think Shakespeare would have been foolish to not pay attention to any of that because, who knows how long I'm going to live and I got to produce more plays because this is how I'm like, making money and feeding my family. It's also what I love to do and it's what I'm good at. So why would I throw this all away just to put a thumb in the eye of the new monarch? Um, and so I think we are not left. We have to take her as she is, right? We have to take her arc as it is. Um, However it is, and I'm not the only one to notice this. AC Bradley also noticed this too. Like it's dissatisfying, and even he said that back in 1904. And so it's not just myself that finds this dissatisfying. It's many people post 16th century and post 17th century that find this ending to be somewhat flat for her, right? Um, and by the way, I'm going to draw a parallel here, and then we're going to go talk about the witches because I really want to talk about the witches.
Yeah.
Sorry,
So
my ear pods just died. So if my sound is different, let me know and I'll go get my other set of headphones.
no, you're good. No,
All
you're
right,
fine.
good. Cool.
Um, so Lady Macduff,
Mm-hmm.
right? Different kind of character, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think she's represents what women, quote unquote, should act like. Even though she's still like, oh, your father's dead, he's not coming back. Well, they were still, women were still sassy. They were still able to like, speak their mind and stuff like that within the confines of the marriage, as long as they weren't ruling over their husbands.
hmm
That was the big
She
thing.
very much reminded me of a person who would and this is sort of an element from African American culture. Your daddy stepped out for cigarettes and he's not coming back. It's
Hmm.
sort of that moment,
Yeah.
right? And but you know what? Her son, weirdly enough, then sort of takes that. But again, there's some resonance there even to our times where, you know, a single mother has a challenge with a father who is not there, or an ex-husband or boyfriend or whatever, and the children in that dynamic are the ones who suffer, right? And they suffer because they don't know who their father is, or they have a misunderstanding or a thing in their head that is of their father that isn't the reality that that woman has had to deal with. And so you've got all these different dynamics happening with Lady Macduff and her son and all that. And of course, Shakespeare wraps all this up by having them all executed, because that's a good way to end that. Um, but that holds true to that period, though. Like, you got rid of your enemies, you got rid of their families. That was just the way things worked. Um, so Lady Macduff is a fascinating counterpoint to Lady Macbeth. And we've sort of talked around the weird sisters for a whole variety of reasons, because I want to now land on that target. So let's go back to the play for just a moment. Let's sort of set them up. So we're gonna go to Act 4, Scene 1. Starts off with thunder, which I particularly enjoy. It says, "Enter the three witches." All right. And I quote, "First witch, thrice the brinded cat hath mewed. Second witch, thrice and once the hedge pig whined. Third witch, harper your cries, 'tis time, 'tis time. First witch, round about the cauldron go, in the poisoned entrails throw. Toad that under cold stone days and nights has 31. Sweltered venom sleeping got, boil thou first in the charmed pot." The witches circled the cauldron. All, double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. Second witch, fillet of a fenny snake in the cauldron boil and bake. Eye of newt and toe of frog, wool of bat and tongue of dog. Adder's fork and blindworm's sting, lizard's leg and howlet's wing. For a charm of powerful trouble, like a hell broth, boil and bubble. All, double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. Third witch, scale of dragon, tooth of wolf, witch's mummy, maw and gulf, of the ravine, salt sea shark, root of hemlock digged in the dark, liver of blaspheming Jew. Pause. Interesting bit of anti-Semitism there. Back to the soliloquy. Gall of goat and slips of yew, slivered in the moon's eclipse. Nose of Turk and Tartar's lips. Finger of birth, strangled babe, ditch delivered by a drab. Make the gruel thick and slab. Add thereto a tiger's chaldron for the ingredient of our cauldron. All, double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. Second witch, cool it with a baboon's blood, then the charm is firm and good. Enter Hecate to the other three witches. Not Hecate, Hecate to the other three witches. Hecate, oh, well done, I commend your pains, and everyone shall share in the gains. And now about the cauldron sing, like elves and fairies in a ring, enchanting all that you put in. So music and song, black spirits, etc. Hecate exits. Second witch, by the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes. Open locks, whoever knocks. Enter Macbeth. Macbeth, how now, you secret black and midnight hags? What is this you do? All, a deed without a name. I conjure, Macbeth, I conjure you by that which you profess, however you come to know it. Answer me, though you untie the winds and let them fight against the churches, though the yeasty waves confound and swallow navigation up, though bladed corn be lodged and trees blown down, though castles topple on their warders' heads, though palaces and pyramids do slope their heads to the foundations, through the treasure of nature's Germans tumble all together, even till destruction sicken, answer me to what I ask you. First witch, speak. Second witch, demand. Third witch, we'll answer. First witch, say if thou hast rather hear it from our mouths or from our masters. Macbeth, call him. Let me see him. First witch, pour in sow's blood that hath eaten her nine farrow grease that's sweeten. From the murderer's gibbet throw into the flame. All, come high or low, thyself and office deftly show. Then there's thunder, a first apparition, an armed head, and then we're off to the races. So, A.C. Bradley, in his examination of Shakespeare's tragedies, wanted to avoid and was very intentional in saying in his analysis of the witches that we should avoid religious analysis of them. He was very specific in pointing that out. And Katie has pointed out that the witches as characters exist during a time when James I, who I believe, if I'm not mistaken, is the one that authorized the King James version of the translation of the Bible, if I remember, it's correct. Correct. The
Oh
same
yeah.
King James. Yeah. Okay, cool. I knew I had my history correct. Yes. All right. Um, so, um, so we are in a religious period in the context of Macbeth, with Catholics and Protestants fighting each other, everyone trying to, how can I put this, establish authority on the Word of God. And we do talk about the Bible sometimes on this podcast because, quite frankly, I hold to the idea that the Bible, whether you believe in an all transcendent God or not, that's actually an irrelevancy. You actually should know something about the Bible because it does sit at the bottom of Western civilization. It's that hoary old book that we actually just can't dig past. It's all the way down there. Even Nietzsche couldn't get past it, and it drove him kind of crazy for good reason, by the way. And so the Bible sits down there like a well, like a hoary old thing, and it influences all of these things that we do, these stories that we tell, these narratives that we have, even the language that we have. And it influences us even when we attempt to go away from it, as Bradley pointed out that Shakespeare was trying to do. As a matter of fact, in Shakespeare's analysis of the Three Witches, he makes the point that in Bradley's analysis of Shakespeare's Three Witches in Macbeth, he makes the point that the Shakespeare was writing in terms of an Elizabethan era that was secular or was becoming more secular and was beginning to abandon religious conviction. Not nearly in the way that we have in our time, but the beginnings of that sort of abandonment were being set there. And so Shakespeare was writing to a secular audience. He was still writing to an audience, however, and I would push back on Bradley in this way. He was writing to an audience that was very familiar with nature, very familiar with the natural world, very familiar with things happening in the natural world that had no scientific explanation because science hadn't really fully been established the way we understand science yet. Rene Descartes had yet to come around with philosophy. Galileo was in the wings. And of course, Martin Luther was running around making trouble everywhere. And the descendants, Calvin, I'm looking at you, were making trouble all over Europe. By the way, during the time of Shakespeare, the New World had also been founded, and there were all these other people that suddenly existed on the globe where nobody had ever anticipated people existing before. They didn't have an imagination for it. So it's easy for Christian people to make a religious claim about Macbeth. I think it's very easy for Christian people to do, or people with a Christian bent. And I don't think they're wrong. I don't think that's a wrong analysis, but I also don't think that it's a complete analysis. And it's easy for post-Christian materialists to make a psychological claim about Macbeth and to say that all that spiritual stuff with the weird sisters and all of the bubbling cauldron, all that's a stand-in for other ontologically material things, and it doesn't have any more meaning than that. Okay, okay. I think you're also missing part of it there. I think it's far more accurate to say that the weird sisters represent all of the things that we can't identify or explain, and we put them into a bucket and we go, I don't know about any of this. And we close the bucket and we put it over there. However, I think that if someone is reading this with more of a with more again of a maybe a religious, maybe not necessarily specifically Christian, but a religious background, or someone who's reading it maybe more with a psychological bent, they can go down either one of those two roads I mentioned before. But for the average person, the average leader, I do think it's very easy to just take the weird sisters, understand, and by the way, with even the framing of the weird sisters, oh, it's weird. Fine, I don't have to consider it. Just put it in a box and push it away because it's just too much. But I think the weird sisters stand in for something that we actually can understand. I think they stand in for misplaced ambition and hubris and deceit and arrogance. These things that we used to call the seven deadly sins, but we don't like that word, so we don't use it anymore. But I think all that stuff, not I think, all that stuff is still there. Vanity, greed, anger, lust for power or for other things. All those things are still there. Those impulses haven't gone away, even though we're all sophisticated now with the iPhones and the streaming. It's all still there. And the witches, they're still swirling that cauldron. They haven't gone away. So I'm going to change that last question there. I'm going to go with this one. Katie,
Mm-hmm. I
what are
hope
we
I
to
have the
take?
answers.
Yeah, what are we to take from the three witches? Because I think you probably have a maybe a slightly different take on this than I do, which is fine. But I also think I think you might agree with some of my thought process on this. So yeah, what do you think about the three witches here, the weird sisters, such as it were?
I would think I think yes, I probably am going to agree with everything you're saying, in addition to going back to James's fascination with witchcraft. So
Yeah.
like he had a lot of, instances where like people were, essentially he had the threat of witchcraft against him personally. There were some
Hmm.
people, I think I can't pronounce his name, Gillis Duncan and Agnes Sampson, they admitted to using witchcraft on him specifically to bring harm to him at the request of the Earl of Bothwell in 1590. Um, Another 4 additional magical plots were uncovered against James on the way to Denmark, with him and his wife on the ship. Like, their he their boat was kind of like ravaged by the storm, and he essentially was like witchcraft, so like he blamed a lot of the things on witchcraft, which he was prevalent in his fear, right? And so he wrote
Hmm.
a treatise on witchcraft in 1597 called Demonology, um, where he kind of like talks about all of the evils and things of witchcraft. So going back to Macbeth the play, these witches just represent, just witchcraft in general and the supernatural and the occult and anything that is against, God and the king, because the king was a vessel for God on earth, essentially,
Hmm.
his divine will.
Yep.
And then witchcraft by proxy became disobedience to the earthly authority of James as king. So kind of then in that instance, these witches kind of represent being against the king, being against, the line, the proper lineage, like Duncan is ruling right now, everything is fine, and they come in and they like, in my opinion, sometimes I think they're just there to stir the pot, literally
Hmm.
and figuratively, right? So they're like, and I don't know what their motivation is. Like that's, who knows? You can make
Right.
up a bunch of stories. You could take Macbeth and you could write a little prologue for it, and you can kind of like, the witches come in the beginning anyway, but like you could create whatever background you want as a director, and you can use your imagination. But these witches essentially are like the puppet masters of the entire play. If they hadn't come up to Macbeth and Banquo and been like, "You're gonna be king," or you're Glamis
Yep.
now, you're gonna be Cawdor, and then you're gonna be king hereafter. And then even Banquo's like, what are you talking about? You're weird. Wait a minute, tell me more about myself. And then,
Right.
so it's like, well, you have a whole succession of kings, but you won't be king, but the rest of you are. So then like they're there to plant a little seed. They're doing the
Hmm.
devil's work. Like, let's destroy the sanctity of the divine will of God in this rule of king by planting this little seed here and saying, okay, we're just going to like give him a little information, and then we're going to see what he does with it. So maybe, like I said, maybe like they use their influence to enchant Lady Macbeth, and she's unsexing herself and she's calling upon the dark arts to, help her essentially lose all of her femininity and then become like this creature of the devil to do this horrid deed against the king, the divine will of God,
Hmm.
right? But yeah, but you know, if Macbeth had not listened to the witches, if he had not, you know, listened to his wife, if he had not even, you know, gone on his own and decided based on what they told Banquo, oh well, they told Banquo he was gonna like be a line, have a line of kings. None of this would have happened. So like,
Hmm.
you know, they are like basically they're like, oh, here we go. We're gonna like have fun and like tell a little story and we're gonna do all this fun stuff and just for their own enjoyment, maybe for the, you know, for the devil. You know, Hecate is like, you know, she historically I'm not like as super familiar with her. I know like a lot of like people of pagan religions like they'll worship like the goddess Hecate now. I don't know
Hmm.
exactly what Hecate represented in terms of um this particular play. I think she was like you know, associated with like the devil and
Hmm.
like all that kind of stuff. So essentially, like these are, you know, evil beings and you know, villains of this play, like, but in our own modern viewpoint on them, I'm like, they're cool, you know, they're they're cool. And you know what's really interesting about their speeches, and this is something I learned when I was doing A Midsummer Night's Dream. So the language of supernatural beings in Shakespeare was not written in iambic pentameter. It was written in trochaic tetrameter. So their poetry has a different rhythm than
Hmm.
everybody else's in the play. And so do any other supernatural creatures from any of his other plays. So so Puck speaks in
Hmm.
tetrameter, right? Caliban and Ariel, they speak in tetrameter. I'm trying to think of another person, but like there are other characters, and this is very specific to the language of like the supernatural. And that's just something else I find super fascinating about the witches.
So I was reading a book, and so we covered the book Ben-Hur, Tale of the Christ by Lou Wallace a couple episodes ago, and it was one of the best-selling books of the 19th century in America. And you may be familiar with Ben-Hur. It was the movie made in the 1950s, late
Hmm.
1950s, Charlton Heston with the chariot race,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. That's right.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So the book that came out of is a book that, and we explored this theme, and I want to bring this over here as we begin to close here with Macbeth a little bit because I think there's some relevance here. So that book, Ben-Hur, was written to a population in America in the 19th century that understood the sacred in a way that we don't. They understood and accepted it in a way that we don't. Um, Now that their understanding of the sacred came from a rock-ribbed understanding of Protestant, American Protestant Christianity in the three main strains: Baptist, Methodist, and then Episcopalian slash Lutheran slash Reformed, right? Those folks that wound up in that other box. Um, and Ben-Hur was written to people who just assumed a certain type of language or a certain type of narrative set of structures, right? That we no longer assume. Okay. And that's what makes it interesting to read, actually, because it's kind of like getting an insight into other people's mindsets. Thinking about Macbeth, thinking about the 16th century, England, and we brought this up several times, but I want to narrow in on this. I think the Weird Sisters represent that element of the sacred
Hmm.
that, as Camille Paglia would say, has always existed outside of the church, um, and has always been in her book Sexual Personae, she would say that it is the thing that drives the arts. All that stuff outside the church is the thing that drives the arts. Because if it didn't, you wouldn't have a place for decadence or homosexuality
Hmm.
or feminism or any of these other things that we've now moved from. I don't know that she would frame it this way, but maybe she would. That we've moved from the edges to the center, right? She would say that there had to be a place for that because the church recognized, she makes this point early in her book, that you had to push those things to the edges if you were going to create a dominant power structure, although that's not the term she uses, but that's what she means. If you were going to create a dominant power structure that was going to do any of the kinds of things that the church was going to do. And that was going to take 1,000 years, and it was going to be a never ending. and Paglia would frame it this way: a never-ending struggle that just never stops. It's constant, right? It's even constant in our time. And while Paglia wrote this back in the late 80s, early 90s, and then thusly became persona non grata on in a whole bunch of different ways because of what she wrote, I don't think she was incorrect, actually. And I think we have the exact same dynamic happening today, just to bring Macbeth forward. I think we have the same dynamic today, but the wizards and the soothsayers and the folks who are looking for the sacred are doing it through technology
Mhm.
rather than through nature, because we believe we've overcome nature. We believe that we've banished all of that stuff to the outer darkness, never to bother us again. But, and this is what the Weird Sisters show, it always sneaks in somehow. So I'll use myself as an example. The number of people in my life who I have known who are practicing witches is kind of shocking.
Mhm.
And I'm not talking about, oh, I just dabble a little bit in it. No, I'm talking like they're full on, like in the poop, such as it were. Like they are in the thing. I'm thinking of three people right now that are, I will not say names, I'm not going to out these people because that's not what they're asking me to do. But that's just three that I know of very prominently in my life that actively practice these acts. And I don't think I'm alone in that. I think we all know people in our lives who are actively pursuing, whether they call it witchcraft, whether they call it crystals, whether they call it tarot, and it's these attempts to bring something back from the natural world back into this thing, because what has replaced religion is technology, and so now the
Mhm.
technological edifice is being built in our time, and what Macbeth says to us, I think now is you can't push all that stuff to the edges. It's the Camille Paglia, sort of critique,
Yeah.
basically just brought from the 16th century. It's always going to come in, and it's gonna be like trying to stomp roaches with like sneakers on your hand in a bad apartment in New York City. You're never going to get all of them. They're going to hold a conference in the walls. Like that's just it, and they're going to surprise you when you least expect it and turn the light on. And I think the reason, again, this is another point of think where I think moderns get away from the Weird Sisters. We don't have language. We've abandoned the sacred language to be able to describe all of this. And so when you don't have language for it, you kind of don't know what to say. You're
Mhm.
just sort of standing there nakedly observing. Like I'm just observing this person who just told me that. I'm thinking of a person I met years ago at a training. She literally walked up to me and she said, um, I'm going to go. It was a leadership training. I won't say what organization, but like she walks up to me, and this is a woman who was like in a professional woman, high up in the organization, whatever. And she says to me, so I'm going to go for lunch and I'm going to do my crystals practice. And I said, I don't know what that means. And she started explaining to me what that meant. And this is not a stupid woman. This is not a whatever, like college educated, master's degree, worked up the organization, got the six-figure salary, got the three-piece suit, and she's having a serious conversation with me about practicing her crystals practice. We don't know what to do with that interaction because we've lost the language for it. Um, Now, as a person who's a practicing Christian and trying to like walk in that mode, I have some language to be able to deal with that in my brain, and I have some ways to deal with that and be able to manage that and navigate it. But I think for the vast majority of people who don't have that language, the witches sort of stand as they can stand as a proxy for how you deal with this. What's the language that I need in order to see this beyond just, you know, cauldron burn and double double toil and trouble, which are great lines, by the way. Like they're
Yeah.
fabulous lines. That's why they stick in people's heads. But even beyond that, like, or even something wicked this way comes, which is the title of a Ray Bradbury book, right?
Yeah.
Or Ray Bradbury story. So like even beyond that, like it gives you a language, I think, if you have no other language, it gives you a framework to put these things in versus the I don't know box and just slamming it and running it away, running away, you know. So that's why I won't say I like them, but I appreciate the fact that they are there.
Yeah. I think to your point, in terms of not having the language to kind of discuss this, I think it's because these kind of things, like witchcraft in general, and like, the sacred, worshiping back with the crystals and everything, which I fully understand. I am actually, I use crystals and I understand the tarot and I kind of try to work with the natural world. I think it's been so stigmatized with like, within our society. Like you think about witch hunts, they're still, prevalent today. Like the term witch hunt is used to describe like people attacking another
Hmm.
person, like, for their beliefs, right? So while today it's more accepted, especially with social media, witches and things like that, I think there's still this stigma of like, well, that's woo woo, that's weird. I don't want to touch it because that's anti-God and like that's the devil's work. So there's still that fear, I think, of
Hmm.
it, that doesn't allow us to really connect to it. So the witches then in Macbeth are kind of like, they're kind of playing God in a way, right? So they kind of give Macbeth the rope to hang himself with,
Hmm.
just maybe for fun. I don't know what their
Hmm.
motivation is. They're just there,
Hmm.
face value. They're just
Hmm.
there to kind of like start the story.
Well, and I wonder how much, I wonder what, I mean, Shakespeare wouldn't say this, I don't think.
No, probably not.
But but we will say it in our own time because again,
Yes.
we're after that, right? Um, I think one of the tragedies of Macbeth is that he did have free will. That actually
Yeah.
is one of the tragedies.
Hmm.
So there's a lot of talk among the technologists, Yuval Noah Harari, Elon Musk, many others, that the rise of artificial intelligence, and we always talk about artificial intelligence, at least once on this show, so this is the time.
Mm.
But the rise of AI, the rise of LLMs is going to challenge the idea of human free will. And as a
Hmm.
matter of fact, a lot of those folks think that human free will doesn't exist and has never existed, because we can push you with the algorithm and you respond. So you respond the way we want you to. So how could free will exist? And yet, to your point, Macbeth still has to take action. If Macbeth doesn't take action, his wife yelling at him all the day doesn't matter. Like my wife could yell at me all day about taking out the garbage. If I don't take action, it's going to sit there. It's going to sit there in the garbage can, you know, much to my wife's chagrin. And I'll deal with the chagrin. Like the chagrin is whatever. Like I'll deal with all the consequences of that, right? But it's going to sit there if I don't take action, right?
Hmm.
Um, just like as an entrepreneur or as a leader, if I don't take action, things don't happen. And so I firmly believe that humans have free will, and that we engage in free will ways in all kinds of different ways. Um, and the dynamics of fate or these other ideas that are coming from the outside, surely they are influences. And because two things can be true at once, and we still have free will.
Hmm.
We still have to make a decision. We still have to decide. We still have to say, yes, I will open the door to this, or no, I'm going to close I'm going to close the door. Uh, we have to say that, because I don't know why reality works this way. I just know it does. There's something that works there where permission has to be given, and I'm the one that has to actively engage. Um, and if I don't actively engage with it, then there we go. It's just gonna be there's gonna be it's just gonna be there, right?
Yeah.
Um, okay. We try to wrap up the show. We try to talk about sort of what we could get overall from what we've covered. And I would encourage you to go out and read Macbeth. To Katie's point, it is short. It is an easy read. You are probably familiar with the story. You will see lines in it that you know from other places, and you'll go, "Oh, hey, this came from Macbeth." So there you go. You'll know the root of where all these great lines came from. Um, we've talked about a lot of these areas. Um, Macbeth gives us a framework, I think, and I would like to, as Katie has mentioned, I agree with her on this. I would like to see somebody adapt Macbeth in a different kind of way, kind of like I believe oh, what was that biker show that was on years ago on FX? Sons of Anarchy.
Mhm.
Yes, Sons of Anarchy was supposed to be like Hamlet, just with a biker gang. I heard it described that way. I would love to see Macbeth adapted to some sort of like HBO show over 12 episodes and like build it into a modern kind of thing. And that's me giving you all a free idea. So go off and run away with it. I can't do it. I don't have time. Just go do it. Okay. And you don't have to send me any money. It's cool. Um, so I want to tie this in at the end here because this episode, when we release it, is going to be right around the time of the 81st anniversary of the dropping of the bombs on Nagasaki and on Hiroshima. A truly tragic circumstance. Yes, driven by the exigencies of war, but a truly tragic circumstance nonetheless that we have never really built a tragic story adequate to the nature of that thing. Oppenheimer kind of gets close. The Christopher Nolan Christopher Nolan movie from a couple of years ago, kind of gets close. And we've had stories about the bomb, and we've had movies about that and about the outcome of the bomb, like Doctor Strangelove or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb or Fail Safe. Like we've had movies about that, and we've had books about thermonuclear destruction and about what happens afterward. But the actual fact of the bomb itself, we don't really have a lot of good narratives to wrap our arms around that tragedy. Human beings fundamentally need tragic narratives. As uncomfortable as they may be to write, and as dark, to Katie's point earlier at the beginning of the show, as dark as they may make us feel, we need that. We need to be able to integrate that, not to go all Jungian, but to integrate that into ourselves and figure out how to deal with it. Um, we have to figure out what the frame is for those tragic circumstances to be able to talk about them instead of metabolizing them as a policy debate or dismissing them as just weird and just moving on. In the last 25 years in America, we have spent a lot of time just metabolizing as policy debates things that have happened to us as a country, all the way from 9/11 to COVID. We still don't have a good story around COVID. We actually don't. Just like we don't have a story around 9/11. We don't have a story. And by the way, this would probably help with all that polarization that we've got if we had a story. Probably be helpful. I think that over the next quarter of a century, though, as we have an entire generation of people that won't have any emotional connection to these acts,
Mhm.
I think we're going to get some of those tragic stories, and we need to be open to hearing them and to experiencing them. And I think Macbeth, to a certain degree, along with Othello and King Lear, and yes, even Hamlet, Shakespeare's four big tragedies, I think these plays may show the way for future generations, like the 9-year-old who lives in my house and eats my food right now, may show the way for folks who are coming up how to put a box, how to put a frame around these circumstances that are happening to us. That way they make sense, that way they somehow have meaning or some kind of significance. Katie, how can leaders, you'll have the last word here, how can leaders stay on the leadership path by reading Macbeth?
Well, I would certainly say that Macbeth gives us a lot of lessons in what not to do, right? But we can take some of the lessons from Macbeth. I have a couple that I can think of based on like, my readings. One of them, don't catastrophize. Um, Planning for the worst is sometimes a good idea, but that can limit you to seeing the bigger picture of things and what the best possible outcomes might be. having different pathways for different potentially unpredictable outcomes and hoping for the best possible one is probably, a great outlook to have for a leader. The people that you are leading, they're looking up to you to make the best decisions for their welfare. And the important thing is to keep an optimistic mindset and not spiral when things don't go your way or out of your control. And part of that, I think, is accepting that there are some things that are outside of your control, and that's okay. You can't control everything. And I think this need for control can really screw up the whole workplace dynamic, right? The whole dynamic of the team, whatever team you're leading. You can't control everything, and you have to trust and ask for help when you need it. Like one of the downfalls that Macbeth faced was the fact that after the murder of Duncan, he didn't seek help. He was no longer a team with Lady Macbeth, right? He thought of killing Banquo on his own. He went to the witches by himself. Everything that happened after that, he did on his own. So he didn't ask her for help. Maybe he was embarrassed. Maybe he was ashamed of his manhood and wanted to prove himself to her. But, you need to seek help when you need it. Yes, you're in charge, but you might not have all the answers. And I think it's important to counsel with other people with other different viewpoints and get advice when you're not stuck trying to solve a challenge. Swallow your pride and humble yourself, right? And Macbeth started the play as a war hero, but he ended it as a war criminal. So if I think you keep a good head on your shoulders and don't let your ambition and pride change who you are fundamentally as a person, and don't let your ego get in the way of your own successes, you'll be in pretty good shape on your leadership path.
Awesome. I think that's a great place to end. So I want to thank Katie Mestres for coming on the Leadership Lessons from the Great Podcast, or Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Oh, gotta get it out correctly today here. And with that, well, we're out. Order my latest book, 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership, with Bradley Madigan. This book offers insights, ideas, and presents a framework for addressing the most pressing challenges in the postmodern leadership landscape we are navigating today. Pick up the paperback, hardcover, or ebook everywhere you buy books, and leave a review on Amazon. And thanks.